Hi, this is Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors. In today's video, we're going to talk about the impacts of longevity on your retirement, both living too short, if you will, but also what if you live too long? Many things are impacted by longevity when it comes to decisions around pension, around Social Security, what kind of risk you can take, what kind of rate of return you need to be shooting for, your estate, many things like that. So we take this decision, it gets complicated even more so if we look at, in a married position, what if one spouse has great longevity and everyone in their family lives to be in their 90s or close to 100? On the other hand, sometimes we visit with people and they also say, well, hey, nobody in my family makes it past about 73, 74. Unfortunately, if only life were that simple, right? If we knew the exact date of our expiration, it makes a lot of this planning a little easier. But since we don't, let's talk about the decision process and some of the things you need to make sure you're aware of in planning for retirement. So if we talk about longevity on the short end, it says, well, if somebody truly had a reason, whether it was a particular health issue or whether it was some heredity, it says, when we look at those average life expectancies, it will tell us, okay, the average life expectancy for a male in the U.S. is maybe around age 81, 82, for a female, 84, 85. However, that's not the full story. When you actually look and say, what about people who have already made it to age 65? Because that average longevity is taking into account, unfortunately, all the people who didn't even make it to that age. So for many people, when you plan for your retirement, you need to have a plan that you may spend 20, 25 years in retirement. So the issue of not planning long enough actually becomes the more critical of the two issues. If you planned as if you were only going to be here, for a short amount of time, well, you may make certain decisions that look good in the beginning, such as starting Social Security right at 62 or as soon as possible, but may leave you or your spouse actually in worse shape for the long run. And speaking of Social Security, if you want to look at those decisions and all the nuances that go into just Social Security, make sure to check out our previous video. We've taken a pretty in-depth dive on the decisions around the timing of Social Security. But that's only one decision. If you're also fortunate enough to have a pension, so do you elect the pension that lasts your entire life, or do you take the lump sum? That decision on the pension not only impacts you, your spouse, potentially your beneficiaries, it also impacts your taxes in retirement. So once again, we've had a thorough discussion on tax strategy in retirement, but you can begin to see how all of these decisions begin to sort of fit together. And so it's impossible to make one decision in one area without impacting other areas of your retirement. But if we go back, let's focus on this longevity issue for a second. It says, well, if you really thought you were only going to be here a certain length of time, below average, so you chose early Social Security, you chose maybe the lump sum instead of a lifetime pension, or you chose to say, well, I don't really need that high a rate of return because I'm not going to be here that long, and I can go ahead and just spend money a little more freely because, again, I don't think I'm going to be here that long. You may have had a pretty comfortable or some fun years early in retirement, but what happens when you begin to turn age 80, 85, etc., you're going to have to make some pretty uncomfortable decisions, around what to cut. The joke around my family is, my grandmother lived to be about 93 years old, but from about 85 on, she would always joke and say, well, I don't know if I'm going to be here next year. Well, she made it another 8 years, beyond that. So let's perhaps take a more conservative or a more prudent approach and assume that you're going to be here for a longer time period in retirement, perhaps even longer than you initially think. Well, now things revolving around long-term care will become an issue. Things around maybe delaying on Social Security, or more importantly, how to maximize that Social Security benefit between you and a spouse, and pension and decisions around pension, or even investments that can create a pension-type stream of income. So those become more appropriate the longer you may need things to last in retirement. But just as important, you also have to then take into account, well, if I'm going to be here longer, how does inflation impact my retirement? Do I then need to shoot for a higher overall rate of return, but at the same time, keep risk in check? So those kind of things become a much more nuanced decision when you've got a plan for retirement that may be 20, 25, potentially even 30 years, in retirement. When we talk about decisions around longevity, whether it becomes a situation where you may have a shorter than normal, life expectancy, or if there's a high likelihood you may be here into your 90s or beyond, the key things you need to consider, once again, is how do you make sure you have a plan to make sure that the income lasts? So whether that's pension, Social Security decisions, you've got to have a plan to make sure the investments can keep up with inflation, grow enough to last your entire lifetime, and at the same time, either be there to cover long-term care expenses should those come up down the road, or make sure you've got a strategy that addresses the long-term care expense itself, and perhaps also make sure that if you've got a spouse or loved ones, that you need to make sure you're leaving some money behind to make sure they're cared for. Those become much more critical decisions when you need to make sure you have a plan that lasts 20 to 25 years. So the best recommendation we always give people is to make sure that you have what's called a holistic or a comprehensive plan that's not just looking at those decisions individually, but looking at how do they impact your overall retirement when you account for not just the investments, but also the tax impacts, the longevity decisions as we discussed today, and perhaps the estate plan or your wishes for what happens when you're not here. So we hope today's video has been helpful in bringing up the things you need to consider when you have to plan for potentially a long time in retirement. If this video has been helpful to you, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You can check in on some of our other videos where we more directly address some of the tax planning and decisions around Social Security and pensions as well.